We're very honored to have Hank Meijer with us. Thank you, Hank, for being with us. It's such a special way to end the year. And little did we know that this Grand Rapids businessman was working on a life quest to tell the story of Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg. And here it is. He's reached the Holy Grail. Arthur Vandenberg, The Man in the Middle of the American Century, published by the University of Chicago Press. It's a great achievement. Congratulations to you, Hank. Congratulations. Yeah. And we're all aware of the great contribution of the Meijer family to our community, the excellence in business and the civic and community gifts that make our community such a great place to live. Little did we know we had an author and historian in the bunch, and he is filling the gap of a story that many of us right here in our own area and state just didn't know much about. And it's great now that we can learn about Arthur Vandenberg, a very important person in state and national and world history. Thank you. We have a very simple agenda tonight. We'll have some introductions. Hank will give us a presentation on his book and his journey. Dr. Erica Kubik, who's our Director of Programming, will have a microphone and we'll have Q&A. And then there'll be time for Hank to sign his book and more time for conversation and fellowship. So before we bring Hank up here, it's my privilege to bring my colleague and predecessor, Dixie Anderson, the Director of the World Affairs Council, Emeritus, and she has a bit of a personal introduction of Hank. Let's welcome Dixie.
Thank you, Michael. Can everybody hear me? I have to say I've been here for 22 years. I have always worn my name tag, and tonight I couldn't find my name tag, so I don't know if that's a sign or what, but I am Dixie Anderson, Executive Director Emeritus, but I think I know most of you, if not all of you, so welcome. So nice to see all of you. When Hank began doing the research for his book, and I'm not going to say how long ago, I said to him, when the book is done, we'll host a book signing for you. So this is my last World Affairs Council event before I retire at the end of the month after 22 years. So Hank, I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me that you, my wonderful colleague and friend, that this is my last official event to host your book signing. It means a lot to me. I've called upon Hank several times over the years to help me. One of the times was when a sitting president of the United States, it was President Bush in 2007, he came to our council to make a major foreign policy address on the Middle East. And I knew that it was going to be broadcast internationally because it was a major address. So I really wanted to mention during my introduction of the president that besides being President Ford's hometown, we were also Senator Vandenberg's hometown. And I was telling Hank this earlier, because whenever I travel internationally, I'm always pleasantly surprised to find people know who Senator Vandenberg is. When I say, well, I'm from Senator Vandenberg's hometown, they know who he is, typically in conjunction with the Marshall Plan. So I gave Hank a call, a panic call, I have to admit, and said, what should I say? What should I say about the senator? I'm going to introduce the president. And he wrote it for me. So Senator Vandenberg, of course, is our council's spiritual mentor. Our two founders, who most of you probably remember, Judge Doug Hillman and Ed Orr, they were both whippersnappers in their 20s when they started our council in 1949. But they made certain that Senator Vandenberg knew about our council's startup. Of course, you know, because he was such an internationalist, he inspired these two young men to start the council because of his global outlook. He was back in Grand Rapids by that time, So he was happy to know about the council, and he agreed to speak to us, well, not us, I wasn't even born then, but please, I want that known. There's some people that think I was around. But he offered to speak at the council, but of course he was really too ill before then, so never was able to do that. And I'm so sorry about that, but he remains a mentor to us. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the definitive biography of Senator Arthur Vandenberg. I have already used Hank's book for research. I needed to learn more about Senator Vandenberg and his relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt and the United Nations, so I've already looked that up. The book has already received rave reviews in the Wall Street Journal. So, Hank, again, we are so pleased to have you here. And would you all join me in welcoming Mr. Meijer?
Thank you, Dixie. And I was just thinking that the most important book about what happened in the years right after World War II and the formation of kind of our New World Order was by the Secretary of State under Harry Truman, or his last one, Dean Acheson, and he called it Present at the Creation. And Dixie, you were almost present at the creation of this project, but you were still a child then. This is really a treat to be able to join so many friends and some new acquaintances and some really old friends here. But and I was just thinking that tonight is the eve of the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which had a big effect on how Americans looked at the world too. And Dixie mentioned that Arthur Vandenberg was sort of the mentor in spirit for the World Affairs Council, and unfortunately he was back here over on Morris Avenue dying of lung cancer at the time that the inaugural meetings were held that he might have spoken at. But it's also a very appropriate setting for me because in this room I had lunch a few times with Ralph Hauenstein, who was also a great resource for this book and a wonderful interview subject. Back in 1946, after the war, Arthur Vandenberg was already becoming a world figure when he met a young lawyer who was just out of the Navy. And he was back in Grand Rapids just briefly, stopping by his office at the Pantland Hotel. And he'd just come from one of the peace conferences in Paris. And Gerald Ford was just hanging out his shingle with a local law firm. And he was also the fresh face of the home front movement, which included his father and was challenging Frank McKay, the corrupt Republicans' political machine. And 2 years later, in 1948, Vandenberg was fuming over the refusal of his own hometown congressman, a neighbor down the street on Morris Avenue, to support his efforts to win approval for the Marshall Plan and the other post-war legislation he'd been working on. And he was eager to see Bart Yonkman, the incumbent, challenged. Yonkman was also a McKay man. So when Jerry Ford made a call on the senator, Vandenberg was receptive to the young lawyer's ambitions, and he let it be known that he was backing Jerry Ford. And Jerry Ford never forgot that, and so there's a direct line of influence there. But the Cliff Notes version of this story, and I really look forward to your questions in a few minutes, really starts half a century before that, when a teenager just out of Central High School fell under the sway of the most exciting politician of a century ago, Theodore Roosevelt. And young Arthur was something of a prodigy in government studies. Now, he claimed he'd been reading the congressional record since he was 14. I have no evidence to back that up, so it's in the book, but there's no footnote there. But his first job out of school was working at a biscuit factory downtown, and he was fired the day he left his desk to join a campaign parade for the charismatic young governor of New York, who came to town in the fall of 1900 as a Republican candidate for vice president on the ticket with William McKinley. And young Vandenberg was fired and he was inspired. And he got a job soon after that, after he was fired, at the Grand Rapids Herald. And the Grand Rapids Herald was the Republican newspaper in town. The press was generally Democratic. And his first byline was a big story on the Electoral College. And he was a regular Republican when the city, the state, and even the country at that time were all mostly Republican. And then impossibly soon, he wasn't quite 22 years old, he became editor of the Grand Rapids Herald. And he was making a name for himself on the national stage before he went to the Senate in 1928, where he was appointed upon the death of Woodbridge Ferris, and David Ensler is here tonight, and we're reminded that he was a leader in his own right in Western Michigan. And then Ferris died, Vandenberg was appointed, and then was elected a few months later in November of 1928. While he was still editor of the Herald, he fought for reservations to Senate approval of American membership in the new League of Nations after World War I. He was trying to find a compromise between the supporters of President Wilson, who refused to make any changes to the League covenant that he presented to the Senate, and Wilson's opponents, who were led by the Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Henry Cabot Lodge. But he was sending editorials to Lodge and to other Republicans throughout the debate, and Lodge wrote him back at one point and said, "I'm going to steal your line, unshared idealism is a menace." And then he went on to write speeches for presidential candidate Warren Harding, including Harding's most important foreign policy address, talking about his desire to be a part of the League of Nations, but only with reservations. Again, Wilson had refused to compromise and died after the League of Nations died. So there were high expectations for Vandenberg when he arrived in the Senate in 1928. He was eager to work with the new president, Herbert Hoover. But Hoover, who was so brilliant in so many ways and a very successful engineer and business person, had never held elective office. And he really lacked the finesse, to say the least, in working with Congress. And then when the stock market crashed in 1929, his presidency was doomed. And then Vandenberg tries to work with Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1932. And he's a savvy politician in a state that's starting to turn a little purple. And he's also ready, in a time of national emergency in the Great Depression, to cooperate with the Democratic administration. So he supports some of the early New Deal remedies for a crippled economy. And he has one of his own: savings deposit insurance to protect small depositors and save the nation's banks. Hoover had fought him on it, and FDR does too. But Vandenberg lines up the votes in the Senate, and a new law creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. Now, Roosevelt came to see the value of it, and much to Vandenberg's chagrin, was all too happy to claim credit for what might have been the most successful New Deal legislation. But it was the brainchild of Arthur Vandenberg. As a result of, as the reach of federal power grew, however, Vandenberg tried to draw a good Republican distinction between being social-minded and socialistic. He broke with Roosevelt over executive rulemaking that he regarded as too intrusive, and he was a real vigilante when he thought that the New Deal was overstepping the Constitution. Nor could he abide Roosevelt's attempt to tinker with the Supreme Court, because it had rejected some of his second New Deal legislation. And the hardening of Vandenberg's opposition to Roosevelt coincided with world events that were posing new dangers. This is in the mid-1930s, and the rise of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy were threatening peace in Europe, and the Japanese War Cabinet had ordered an invasion of China. In the face of threats around the globe, Vandenberg fell back on what for him was a first principle: the Hamiltonian tradition, American neutrality, no entangling alliances, as Alexander Hamilton had written for Washington's farewell address. In September 1939, however, debates about neutrality took on a new urgency when German bombers filled the skies over Warsaw and German tanks rolled into Poland. And over a national radio hookup, broadcast from a baseball field at Ramona Park in East Grand Rapids, Vandenberg declared, "This is not our war." Before it became our war, with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, He led the band of isolationists in the Senate, mostly Republican, but Democrats too, who fought Roosevelt every step of the way. They distrusted his every move, fearing that American boys would once again be pulled into combat in a European war. The isolationists fought and lost a fight to keep the arms embargo in the 1937 Neutrality Act that Vandenberg had helped create. They fought and lost a fight over the Lend-Lease deal giving destroyers to the British Navy. Roosevelt was their nemesis, and Vandenberg was their organizing spirit. In 1936, he'd Governor Alf Landon of Kansas's attempt to draft him as his running mate on the Republican ticket, which was a smart move since, as many of you know, Landon carried, or FDR carried every state except Maine and Vermont. And in the run-up to 1940, he was viewed as the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. In fact, and this I learned this in this room talking with Ralph Hauenstein, in 1938, the FBI opened an office in Grand Rapids. And when the agent was sent here and asked about his new assignment, and it was Ralph, who was then the city editor of the Grand Rapids Herald, who became friends of the agent and was asking him, the agent said he'd been told to keep an eye on Arthur Vandenberg. Now, when you think about it, why would the FBI be opening an office in Grand Rapids in 1938? This was not a logical investment in the Depression. So I think Ralph was onto something there, and he swore by it. But Vandenberg and his isolationist colleague, Robert Taft, were swept aside in 1940, along with their traditional isolationist point of view, by a charismatic lawyer, Wendell Willkie, whose willingness to intervene in Europe nearly matched Roosevelt's. And Pearl Harbor made Vandenberg's traditional view look obsolete, and America was soon all in a global war. The nation was all in, but the Senate was not. Roosevelt played his strategy close to the vest. That was the case in May 1943, when a Foreign Relations Subcommittee charged with assessing the wartime and post-war landscape met with General George Marshall. And this is one of Vandenberg's early interactions with Marshall, a relationship that would later become very important. He said, the general gave us a brilliant explanation of the success of the North African campaign. This is Vandenberg writing in his diary. And the senator asked the general about the recent Casablanca conference with FDR and Churchill. And Marshall confided that in sessions with the British, we were always handicapped by the fact that when the British came to a conference with an idea, it is completely developed down to the last degree and has the completely integrated support of the British from Churchill down, including frequently a softening up of our own American situation through the activities of the British secretaries here in Washington. That's another story with British intelligence. He said that this often put us at a disadvantage. Marshall, Vandenberg said, left us with a new pride in the recent exploits of our troops, but he also left us with a new uneasiness about who makes our decisions and how. And to Republicans like Vandenberg, that only deepened suspicions of Franklin Roosevelt. As the war began to turn in favor of the Allies, who had been dubbed by FDR the United Nations, Republicans faced two big questions. One was partisan. Wendell Willkie was what today might be called a rhino. He had been a Democrat until just a few months before he announced for the Republican nomination. He had important newspaper backers, but no party base, and was viewed by most of the GOP as an opportunistic interloper. Any comparisons to the present day will start to get a bit confusing. But his nomination reflected a deep schism in the party, one that's still with us today, between isolationists or unilateralists and internationalists, or those who believe in broader global cooperation. If the Republicans were going to have a chance at the presidency in 1944, these factions needed to come together. But how? The other question on the minds of Americans of all political stripes was, what would the world look like after the war, and what role should the United States play in it? Would the U.S. retreat again as it did after World War I? Back then, Vandenberg's editorials had faulted Wilson and the League of Nations. Now the question was whether and how nations might organize themselves to avoid future catastrophes. And Roosevelt wasn't saying, and he wasn't letting Democrats in Congress tackle the subject either. When they tried to introduce resolutions, and both Democrats and Republicans had all kinds of ideas for what what America's role should be, he would quash them. He didn't want to rock the boat or risk alienating our allies. And he was kind of a one-man band in foreign policy, and his focus, appropriately, was on winning the war. If a proposed post-war organization might, he was worried it might threaten the Russians, as they had their own particular designs on Eastern Europe. It might threaten the British, who of course were hoping to hold on to colonies that were also thinking that this would be their opportunity to seek independence. To answer the first question about Republican unity, the party called a meeting of leading GOP elected officials to be held at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island over Labor Day weekend, 1943. And Vandenberg was chosen to chair the foreign policy group. Not for the first time, he looked for a middle way. In this case, between isolationists who wanted nothing more than to wash their hands of the world, bring the troops home after the war, and these were many of his longtime friends and allies, and the Wilkie adherents who held varying ideas about world federalism and international police force, a revived League of Nations. Republicans came out of that meeting at the Grand with a statement they could run on and an expression of support for some sort of world organization that went beyond anything Roosevelt or the Democrats had offered. And the wonderfully ambiguous, grandly named Mackinac Charter set the stage for things to come. When I succeeded in putting 49 prima donnas together, Vandenberg told Henry Luce of Time magazine, and it certainly took one to know one here, I discovered the necessary formula. For Vandenberg, compromise was almost an art form. He was moving away from isolationism. Pearl Harbor had played a big part in that. So did his nephew, Hoyt Vandenberg, an Air Force general and student of modern warfare who'd been in London for the Battle of Britain and would drop by Uncle Arthur's apartment on a Sunday afternoon in Washington to talk strategy in the kitchen. Vandenberg's mistress, probably planted by British intelligence, probably had much less influence. I think she was there more to eavesdrop than to persuade. But by contrast, he relished the fawning press response to the Mackinac Charter and the GOP taking the lead in advancing support for what would become the United Nations. And it wasn't that Roosevelt didn't believe in it, he firmly believed in it, but he didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to say anything, so the Republicans were able to jump the gun on him. Still, even as Vandenberg was moving in a new direction, it was chiefly behind the scenes. Most of the public still thought of him as the voice of isolationism. And that changed on January 10th, 1945. The Allies were winning the war, closing in on Japan island by island, pushing across the Rhine into Germany. And a weary Roosevelt, in poorer health than anyone knew, was about to leave for the Russian resort of Yalta on the Black Sea to meet with Stalin and Churchill to talk now about what to do as the collapse of the Third Reich drew near. Vandenberg was worried. Neither he nor his colleagues knew what the three leaders would be deciding or what deals FDR might commit to on our behalf, which gets us back to that Casablanca reference with Marshall, where the British had a consistent point of view and the Americans seemed to be improvising, and that led to mistrust of Roosevelt. Vandenberg rose in the Senate to announce a proposal, a post-war security treaty among the victorious Allies to ensure that Germany would never again wage war on its neighbors. Boom. That was the leading isolationist calling for an American commitment to an entangling peacetime alliance with countries that had fought 2 world wars in the last 3 decades. It was, one correspondent said about the speech heard round the world. It was a renunciation of beliefs that Vandenberg had espoused for 25 years. Now, FDR, he was not fond of Vandenberg because of all their New Deal rivalry, and he spoke dismissively when asked about Vandenberg's speech. But the White House made a hasty call for 50 copies before the president departed for Yalta. And within months, the world and Vandenberg's place in it changed very quickly. Roosevelt returned from Yalta knowing that he had no choice if he was to avoid Woodrow Wilson's fatal mistake with the League of Nations other than to appoint Vandenberg, the Republican voice on foreign policy, as a delegate to the conference to be convened in May 1945 in San Francisco to create the United Nations. And then Franklin Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry Truman had had lunch once with the president after he took office. He was a neophyte in foreign affairs, although a decisive one, because he quickly announced that the UN meeting would move ahead. Since Roosevelt had often worked around the State Department in crafting foreign policy, famously sending Harry Hopkins on missions to London and Moscow, the new young Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, was also a marginal player. And Vandenberg's Democratic counterpart on the UN delegation, Foreign Relations Chairman Tom Connally of Texas, was a canny old politician, but of limited range. And that left Vandenberg, the Republican who had come round to speak out first in favor of such an organization, to emerge as the most influential American delegate. When it came time to sit down with the other powers, and this is in the penthouse of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, to design what Vandenberg liked to call the town meeting of the world, his opinion and that of the Soviet Foreign Secretary, Molotov, seemed to be the ones that counted most. He made sure that the UN Charter allowed for regional security agreements so that with the Monroe Doctrine, the US and its Latin American neighbors could have a mutual defense treaty. He made sure there would be enough Republicans on board in the Senate to approve the charter when it landed in their laps. So President Truman needed him. After the charter was ratified, the president asked Vandenberg and Connally to play an unprecedented role in diplomacy. For starters, they were appointed as American delegates to the first General Assembly of the UN in London later in the year. More significantly, they joined the new Secretary of State, James Burns, for conferences with foreign ministers in Paris through much of 1946 to negotiate the peace treaties with countries such as Italy that had fought the war on the German side. 1946 was also the year that Look magazine published a profile of Vandenberg. And in that story are a couple of paragraphs I can't resist sharing that get at aspects of his influence. Every few months, wrote Look, several million people become grateful to Vandenberg for expressing their vague thoughts, such as, what is Russia up to? He was the master politician in his ability to be flexible and principled at the same time, and he had the credibility that went with the reformed sinner. He had always wanted to write a biography of St. Paul, although his political conversion was a little more drawn out. It might take a whirling dervish to follow the pros and cons of Vandenberg's Senate votes over the past 18 years, Look noted, but Vandenberg has whirled as the American people have whirled. Or, as one of his fellow senators put it, Van changes his mind about as often as the average American, but slightly earlier. Now, I think there's sort of an understated hint of genius there, slightly earlier. That means you're not so far out in front that you were a leader without followers, and he was not a visionary, but also that you were not simply part of the pack. You're able to reflect the feelings of Americans who were also struggling for answers. We've been isolationists. We know that isn't going to work after World War II. What do we do now? Or as Emerson said in his essay, Self-Reliance, and Vandenberg was fond of Emerson, speak what you now think in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. So it's be ready to change and willing when the time is right. And that's what Vandenberg was doing, and bringing millions of Americans along with him. And that made a big difference when Truman asked for support of the Truman Doctrine, calling for the U.S. to help nations threatened by totalitarian, read communist subversion. And more specifically, he was supporting Truman when the president asked Americans to pick up the baton from the impoverished British and aid the governments of Greece and Turkey against communist pressure. It made all the difference when Secretary of State Marshall proposed an unprecedented aid program to help the European democracies rebuild their shattered economies. Truman had the political sense to call this the Marshall Plan, after the revered general. Marshall himself said it could have been called the Vandenberg Plan, because he reflected, when it went to Congress, Van was just the whole show. But rebuilding economies was not enough. There was also the power vacuum left by the war, and now being filled in Eastern Europe by the Soviet Red Army. The war-wrecked Western democracies formed a European Union for mutual defense, but they knew they needed the Americans to join to have that be meaningful. And this would be the big one, an entangling alliance which Vandenberg once so adamantly resisted. He now had a Pan-American security treaty allowed under the UN Charter to use as a template. And in fact, his relationship with George Marshall had blossomed in the late summer of 1947, when together they traveled to a resort outside Rio for a meeting of Western Hemisphere foreign ministers for that treaty. From the Rio Treaty came the seeds of the Vandenberg Resolution, which allowed American entry into the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it too sailed through Congress with Vandenberg's leadership. These bipartisan majorities were his pride and joy. In fact, I should have mentioned when that first UN General Assembly, the other delegates with Vandenberg and Connolly were the Secretary of State Stettinius and Eleanor Roosevelt. And this was before there were UN ambassadors to the UN, so it was a delegation. And Vandenberg and Eleanor had a rather bitter relationship. I mean, he's a conservative. She views him as this left-leaning influence on FDR. And she resents his attacks on FDR. And it even came down to some smaller things. One of her pet projects, and there were a number of planned communities during the New Deal that were designed to relieve poverty in Appalachia and be models of planned communities. And one of them in West Virginia was designed to have as its local industry furniture making. So you can imagine how the senator from Grand Rapids viewed a federal project to make furniture with our tax dollars. But then they go to London, they sail to Southampton, they're on the same ship, they become good friends, and by the time they're done, Vandenberg says, I take back everything I ever said about her, and it's been plenty. And she's pleading, because she goes on to continue to be a U.S. representative to the UN, and she's pleading with him to keep doing it. And he's saying, gee, thanks, but I've got to get back to the Senate. But it was wonderful to see that mutual admiration develop between old foes. But those bipartisan majorities and those kind of relationships began to fray about the time that Vandenberg was diagnosed in 1949 with lung cancer. And after fighting fellow Republicans in the House to secure funding for NATO military aid, he was flown to Ann Arbor for an operation that removed half of his left lung. As Mao and the communists emerged victorious in China, where General Marshall had struggled against impossible odds to negotiate an end to the Civil War, Vandenberg was headed back to Morris Avenue in Grand Rapids, to the house he'd built as a young editor in 1907. And he returned to Washington just briefly in 1950, but was too ill to be active. And as he lay dying, he cherished the chatty notes he was receiving from Truman, from Churchill, from so many people, and from Marshall, who reminisced about the days when Marshall's undersecretary, Robert Lovett, had paid regular after-hours calls on the Vandenberg apartment to flesh out NATO and other significant initiatives. It would have been a great relaxer to sit down and have a drink with you and Bob Lovett and decide just how we were going to manage the world and then have done it, Marshall wrote. And Vandenberg replied, those were truly great days. Looking backward, it is really quite amazing how well we and the world got along together. But times were already changing. Not only had bipartisanship suffered amid recriminations over who lost China, and then the Democrats regained the majority in Congress, so they didn't need the Republicans quite as much. And then a young Republican senator from Wisconsin named McCarthy was fomenting fear with wild accusations of communists in the Democratic administration. And war had broken out in Korea. The bipartisan bonds were coming apart, and Vandenberg was not there to patch them up. And that brings us full circle back to Grand Rapids. As Edward R. Murrow told his radio audience the week of Vandenberg's death here in April 1951, we are now divided, bitterly, hysterically. Had he lived, he would have gloried in this conflict and steadied it. And he would have been confident that at the end of the day, little men of loud voice and small faith will yield to the collective judgment of the American people. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll take audience questions and I'll pass around the mic. So if you want to raise your hand, people take questions. So who has the first question? All right.
I'm just wondering what the chances are of someone like Arthur Vandenberg emerging today with a much more complicated world than the one you were analyzing with Senator Vandenberg. Is there any hope for those conditions coming together in your mind?
Well, you wonder about that, and I think of, let's see, when first President Bush was looking for authorization for the first Gulf War, and the Democrats were in the majority, and it was just passed very narrowly, as I recall, in the Senate. You had people saying, where is there a Democrat, a counterpart there to, where's the Vandenberg today? And then a few years later, you had, when Clinton was looking for authorization to intervene in the Balkans, you had the same question asked of the Republicans in Congress. And so the question still comes up, but I think there's a couple of big factors. One is, sadly, the Congress and the Senate, particularly the Senate, I don't think has the stature that it did in the 40s and 50s. And there's certainly been more and more power accruing to the executive, and that's come at the expense of the stature of the legislature. But it used to be, if you were these committee chairmen in Congress, and of course, Professor, you know this better than I do, you had so much power, and you were likely to be a household name. Now, sometimes that power worked against what we perceive the common good, when the seniority of Southern senators blocking civil rights legislation, for example. But other times, they were pivotal to what the country would do. And in fact, I think about that with Vandenberg and Taft sort of divided up their running the Senate or the Republican side, depending on whether they were in the majority or not, with Taft handling domestic and generally deferring to Vandenberg on international, and vice versa. And we don't even remember who the Senate majority leader or minority leader were during those times, but it was the chairman of the Republican conference or the chairman of foreign relations who were calling the shots. So I think that loss of stature there, and then you can't escape the need to have, for bipartisan collaboration, you have to have parties on both sides willing to collaborate. So you come from you need to come from a position of greater power relatively than maybe the Senate has today, and you need a willing collaborator at the other end, on the other side of the aisle or at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, and both seem to be in short supply. Hi, Jack.
I was struck by your anecdote about the rapprochement with his adversary, Theodore Roosevelt, aboard ship. And, as a charming, time period where that could be afforded. And in contrast, maybe comment on how that would contrast with today, where Congress seems to be at each other's throats during the week and then all fly home on the weekend.
Well, you're so right, and the Vandenbergs lived in the Wardman Towers, the Wardman Park apartment, which is the Sheraton, part of the Sheraton Washington complex today on Connecticut Avenue, and there were Supreme Court justices, senators, congressmen, cabinet members, members of the press, all living in this apartment building. And there was one story, I don't think it's in the book, but where Henry Wallace, who's the Secretary of Agriculture, who Vandenberg is lambasting Roosevelt and Wallace in the Agricultural Adjustment Act, where you're going to create scarcity to drive up farm prices, and they're outside on the lawn of the Wardman Park, and Wallace is teaching Vandenberg, showing Vandenberg how you throw a boomerang, and and you just get those relationships. You're right, that just don't exist today. And I remember when Jerry Ford talking about when John Dingle John Dingle talking about when he was going through his divorce, that Jerry and Betty would have him over for dinner. Yeah, I mean, they weren't flying home. They were getting together across the aisle. It's so true.
Hank, it's interesting that there was a newsletter from the Hillsdale College that sends this out every month. They said there was no definitive biography on Vandenberg after 45. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
You now have one. Why Vandenberg for you? I mean, from all the characters that could be done, why did you pick Vandenberg? What's your motive and your goal?
Well, thank you. No,
What follows it?
well, that's the second question. I've always been interested in foreign policy and love talking with Dixie and a lot of people in this room about international relations over the years, and had always been and would keep running across Vandenberg's name in other references. And here's this guy from Grand Rapids who clearly was an important player, but there wasn't much about him. And so, but and I'd done a lot of research on my first book on my grandfather at the Grand Rapids Library, and Gordon Olson, our former city historian, is a good friend. And this goes back to the fall of 1989. And my book on my grandfather came out in 1985. I can consider myself a failed fiction writer. I don't know how to, my wife is a fiction writer. She can create characters. I can't create characters, but I love the idea of, in the first biography and then in this one, of working to understand and explore and explain a character. And so I wondered about Vandenberg, but there was a professor who got his PhD at Michigan, and in 1970 published the book you're talking about. It's called The Evolution of a Modern Republican, Arthur Vandenberg, 1884 to 1945, which of course is stopping before the important stuff, but that was his dissertation, turned it into a book. Michigan State University published it. And so my assumption was that this guy was working, he'd become a professor in Chicago, that he was working on a second volume. And so I was lamenting one day to Gordon Olson that, I'm really intrigued by Vandenberg, and there's not much out there, but the world doesn't need two biographies of Arthur Vandenberg. And so, I don't know what to do. And so Gordon had his own particular self-interest. That year, he was responsible for the Historical Society of Michigan's annual meetings program, where you get a keynote or two, and then you have a dozen speakers speaking on all kinds of different topics of Michigan history. So Gordon said, well, hey, you're interested in Vandenberg, just speak on something, because I've got to fill out my program. And so I spoke on the debate over the repeal of the arms embargo in 1939, and there were 6 people there. This was in Lansing, and actually, trivia, John Logie was actually one of them, but that was in late October of 1989. In early January, I get a call from the daughter of this professor, the adult daughter of this professor in Chicago, and he had just died, and she's coming in from Iowa to Wilmette, trying to close up his house. She's the executor, handle his estate, and doesn't know what to do with her father's basement full of research on Arthur Vandenberg. And this is all, again, I don't want to say pre-computer, because people were using primitive computers, certainly pre-digitization, and these things had no monetary value. They were Xerox copies of papers from the Truman Library, the Roosevelt Library, the British Foreign Office, a lot of different sources. But she hated to just chuck her father's life's work research out on the street. And so she calls the Historical Society of Michigan, says, do you know anybody who has any interest in Arthur Vandenberg? The only person they knew was somebody who'd given a talk on him at their conference 2.5 months before. And so I ended up bringing a van load of papers back from Chicago, and that flipped it from saying the world doesn't need 2 biographies to saying, well, Now, if you don't do it, who's going to? And besides which, having little kids and a day job and no research assistants or graduate students that you could dispatch to Independence, Missouri for a week or Hyde Park, New York for 3 days to get all these, go through all these files, I had inherited it. And so that was just a wonderful sort of energizing moment. And besides which, it made me feel more comfortable that I could concentrate on the two most important pieces of research. And one was the actual Vandenberg papers are at the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan. And I could go spend a lot of time there. And then interviewing people who knew Vandenberg to try to get a sense of what this walking, talking character who died in 1951 was like. And so anyway, that's what got me started.
And your next project?
I'm scared to say I'm actually open to suggestions. And well, no, this is the deal. So this one felt really good. I mean, when I started this, and it was long before we got the statue downtown, if you walk down the street in Grand Rapids and hear Dixie's talking about going to Europe and people knowing Vandenberg, you walk down the street in Grand Rapids and people will say, no, who's Arthur Vandenberg? Well, was he related to the jewelry store? Not related as far as I know, but totally forgotten. And so, you get this sort of hometown character who deserved a biography. In fact, David McCullough has an essay on sort of untold history in Washington, D.C., and he makes reference. This is was written back in the 80s, so it helped energize me, to the need for a biography of Arthur Vandenberg. And I turned in the final draft just about a year ago to University of Chicago. And when I did, it was after the election, and it felt like what I was dealing with was just anachronistic. That it seemed so remote in our past that who's going to care about this at all? And then you step back and you start to discover that actually this is kind of what people are hungering for. This is the way we want our government to function. Now, obviously, it was a unique time when there was a greater sense of urgency around building a consensus, and the choices were more clear cut. But you felt like it had a resonance, and so then you think, well, what should your next project be? And you kind of want that to have a resonance too, but I don't have the confidence necessarily to tackle some really big figure, so what do you do? And then the other caveat is, if it takes me another 25 years, I got to choose very carefully. So you got one shot here, so I got to think about that.
We have time for one last question.
First of all, on the assumption that history is instructive, and I think I probably speak for a lot of people in the room who say we're really stunned by the extent to which the rhetoric, at least, of isolationism has come to the fore in recent years. Can you speculate about what might happen based on the extensive research you did of that period of time of struggle between a global view and an isolationist view?
Wow, it's always scary to speculate, but it is so fascinating because you get this sense of this divided executive branch where, I was just driving home tonight listening to the news, and Rex Tillerson is talking about how vital NATO is. But that's not necessarily the message that his boss is giving out. And it's so unnerving that way. There are some wiser political heads in this room, but it almost feels like we've got the pendulum swinging in one direction, and if we're not careful, it will swing very much in the other direction. Actually, I heard someone speculating on this. And so we're going to have this tumultuous period of 4 years or 8 years until something swings back a little more to the center, and both sides need to take their turn, maybe winning and then losing, for them to recognize that they need each other a little more, or for the American public to just insist on that instead of one thing being a reaction to another. I don't know. I'm scared to speculate further, but that there doesn't seem to, we seem to be far away from a consensus. And now, do we need some more significant crisis that we can coalesce around somehow? I mean, maybe that's the case, but that's a scary scenario. So I think all we can do is sort of remember these virtues and figure out, look opportunistically for places to employ them. I hope we find them. Thank you all so much. This is just a treat. Thank you.